see if okay, do that, try that. All right, and gonna test this. All right, so that's working. Something's working. One thing's working. I guess what I'm gonna have to do is I am going to have to monitor where the camera is. Normally I look at the screen to see where the camera is, so I guess I'm gonna have to do it on my phone today. And so I'm gonna have to minimize that in order to bring up IMC. And we were looking at, last time, we were looking at the communication process here. And we talked about Snowball and Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger and this idea of noise, which is becoming increasingly more difficult in a highly cluttered space for marketers to break through. It used to be that it was easier if we went back even to when I was born in 1973, because we didn't have, in 1973, we didn't have a VHS or a Betamax. And so if you watched television, you were sort of stuck watching the ads. And then the VHS came along, or actually Betamax came along, and people were able to time shift, which allowed for zipping through the content. The other thing that was different when I was a kid growing up that made it harder for people to switch was, so there's zipping where you would forward through the content on the ad. So you'd record something, forward through the ads, and then only watch the content that you were interested in, which was the movie or the television show or something like that. The remote control, so again, when I was a kid growing up, and this was not that long ago, lots of televisions didn't have a remote control. I know this is incredible for you to imagine, but they had these dials on them, and you actually had to get up and change the channel, which was one of the reasons that children were great, because you could get the kid to change the channel. Once we got remote controls, that allowed for zapping, which was people would switch channels in order to avoid the advertisement. So what did the television stations do in order to keep your attention? Well, they would basically all advertise at about the same time, so that even if you were zapping through, you were having to watch. And why is this not picking up? Why is it not? There we go. You're having to watch the content anyway. So all of this noise becomes a problem. Encoding. So transforming your ideas into a set of symbols. Now, in a lot of times, this is done through the written word or through the spoken word, and we assume that we all know what our client is thinking based on what we are saying. But a big portion of this in encoding is not just what is said, which can be problematic in and of itself, but it's also the nonverbals. God, this thing is really, really loud. This microphone is really, really loud. Sorry. The nonverbals. And encoding becomes important in really understanding what it is that you think that you are trying to communicate. So, for example, if I use the word platform, what does that mean? What is platform? I guess I'm going to be really stuck to this spot. What is a platform? Yes.
It's either something that like you stand on to give like a speech, or it's
Right.
going to be something like a medium, like a large medium. Like if I were like an influencer, my platform is like Instagram or things along that line.
Okay, so yeah, this table is a platform for this basket of ducks right there. And it's what I'm using to set the ducks on. If I'm giving a speech, I'm going to stand on a platform. This floor here is my platform for conveying ideas about integrated marketing communication to you for today's class. As you said, if you are a social media influencer, your platform is, are you using TikTok or Facebook or YouTube, or what are the others out there that people use to, the big ones are TikTok and Facebook, I think, and YouTube. Are there any others? Snapchat, Instagram, Twitch. Twitch is Twitter. So those are all platforms that you can use. When computer people talk about platforms, they're not necessarily talking about Facebook. If a computer expert, Eric, who came in here to fix the technology that we're using today and was unsuccessful in fixing that technology, when they say platform, they mean the OS that's operating. And I say OS, and I assume that you all know that. If I say OS to my 88-year-old aunt, and if I keep talking about the OS, she's going to look at me like I'm crazy. If I say, they're using Windows for the OS platform on my work computer, and that means nothing to her, right? She has a computer. I think she knows how to turn it on from time to time. She kind of understands how it works, I think. So when we encode things, a lot of times we assume, based on what we're saying, that everybody understands us. This becomes even more problematic when we think about marketing in a global economy. We no longer sell stuff just in our own economy. Again, if you went back in time not that long ago, if you went back to the time when my mother was born, so she was born on Halloween in 1949, and at that point in time, she remembers a time when most people didn't have a television. And then she remembers when they got a television, for example, the television went off during the day. The television came on in the early morning for news, and then it went off. And I remember a time when television went off. If you were watching one of the major networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, or the public broadcasting station, at midnight, they played the national anthem and the TV went off. The content stopped. That's just incredible. You all can't fathom this. But now we don't just sell stuff. And if you went back to when my mother was born, we produced a lot of the stuff that we consumed in this country on our own. And we didn't rely as heavily on other people. Now we compete in a global world. And so when we encode things, we now have to also think about sort of the translation that we're going to use. One of our major markets for a lot of our services that we export, and we have a net, right? In services, that's one of the areas where we actually produce more than we consume and we export and we don't have a deficit, we have a trade deficit with regard to tangible goods. We import a lot more tangible goods than we export. And we have a net deficit with many countries, China, for example. But in services, we have a net surplus. And so when we think about exporting these things to other countries, well, what are some of the largest markets that we engage with? Well, the European Union. One of the biggest countries of the European Union, now that Great Britain has left the EU, is France. They don't speak English as their primary language in France. Now, almost everybody my age or younger has learned English. Why? Because English is the international language of business. But if we're going to sell our products over there, we're going to have to sort of sell it and market it in French. The word mal, which can mean evil in French, can mean bad in a perfectly ordinary sense of the word. So let's suppose you're marketing a pain reliever, like aspirin. And somebody says, in a commercial, "J'ai mal à la tête." That word mal can mean evil, but you're not literally saying, if you're translating it, you're not literally saying, "I have evil in my head." You're saying, "I have a headache." And so encoding becomes important. And then we have to be sure that the receiver, when they're decoding these sets of symbols and transforming them back into ideas, that they're got the same sorts of ideas that we are trying to communicate. And this can be influenced by a lot of things. Largely by attitudes, how we feel at the moment can influence how we receive and decode a message, whether or not we're receptive to that message, the values that we have. So one of my colleagues in the doctoral program at New Mexico State, before she went into the doctoral program, she sold helicopters for Sikorsky helicopters. That's what she sold. And the way they market those helicopters in the United States, which are very expensive. So I've told you all that I have a commercial pilot's license. I have 2 airplanes. I fly competitive aerobatics. And I always wanted to be a helicopter pilot. But becoming a helicopter pilot is about 3 times more expensive than becoming a fixed wing pilot. Helicopters are enormously expensive items of machinery. Why? Because they got a lot more parts that you have to worry about coming flying off than a fixed wing aircraft. If the engine quits on the fixed wing aircraft, you still got the wings. And people think that, if you lose power in a helicopter that it comes slamming to the ground. It doesn't. It will sort of continue to rotate, but it will fall far more rapidly than a fixed wing aircraft. But they market that in the United States, helicopters, as being for the busy executive on the go who needs to get there. Did you have a question? No. Oh, okay. So they market this as being, for the busy executive on the go. Think about Donald Trump. Before he was president of the United States and when he was doing The Apprentice, one of the things that they would show in that show was he had this helicopter, which was a pretty nice thing to have when you are, a billionaire and you need to get from one place, say Bedminster, New Jersey, into the city in Trump Tower quickly. Why? If you've ever driven in New York City, you can understand that the traffic can be exceedingly problematic. So this idea of, for the busy executive on the go is appealing to that market, and I believe he has one of their helicopters in the United States. When they tried to use that same kind of marketing campaign in South America, it didn't go over very well because that's a different culture. We work more in the United States than almost any other Western nation on earth, with the exception of Japan. Those are the only people that work more than we do. What is the standard vacation in the United States for the average private sector? One of the reasons I am a college professor is I have a 9-month contract, which means that in a few weeks, I'm going to be out of here. And I don't have to teach in the summer if I don't want to. That's not typical. Most people, what do they get in terms of time off in this country? What was the standard? Yeah. 2 weeks. Yeah. Yeah. You get 2 weeks and then maybe some sick leave. That was the standard. Yeah. Yeah, I think there's at least, I know that there's at least like a 4-week. Now, a lot of companies, the company when I was in the industry, we had actually 3 weeks, but it was 1 week of sick leave and 2 weeks of vacation. And a lot of companies are now just doing what they call paid time off, PTO, so that they don't distinguish whether or not it is sick leave or whether or not it is vacation time. But the sort of standard in American practice has been 2 weeks of vacation a year. That's not standard anywhere else in the world. In Europe, as you suggested, I think there's lots more time off. The father of the family that I lived with in Germany, he got something like 6 or 7 weeks off every year, and that was standard in Germany at the time. And then he decided that he was going to have a nervous breakdown, and he went off to the spa, and that was all covered. He decided, I don't know that you can decide you're going to have a nervous breakdown, but they have a lot more time off. And so this idea of, being in a hurry and on the go, particularly when they were trying to sell this in South America, which are, those countries tend to be largely Latino countries, not all, that didn't go over as well. And they had to come up with a different, because of the values that culture has, which are radically different than the values that we have in the United States, where we think that you constantly have to be on the go. And then beliefs. The belief system that we have is going to influence how we decode that. And for communication to be successful, for us to get our message across, both the sender and the receiver have to have a mutually shared field of experience. In political marketing, I think I started to talk about this last time, we see this all the time, in that Republicans and Democrats use the same words, but they attach radically different meaning to those words. Radically different meaning to those words. So, starting with the Reagan administration, a huge number of evangelicals started participating in politics in larger and larger numbers. And they started using this term called family values. And I talked about this, I think, the last time, but again, this is good redundancy. In that they talked about family values, and what they mean by family values, and I said I used this as an example, was the strong father model of family values. It is the Leave It to Beaver experience of the 1950s. There was a television show, again, when my mother was growing up, called Father Knows Best. That was what they mean by family values. When Democrats use that term, family values, they mean the Hillary Clinton book where she took an African proverb called "It Takes a Village." And the idea is that family means more than just maybe the nuclear unit. It can mean aunts and uncles and other people that help raise you, right? So these values and belief systems, so a lot of times what we do is, even in a culture in which we all should have somewhat shared experiences, we find that there are different shared fields or different fields of experience, and we oftentimes are miscommunicating. So feedback involves, again, encoding by the initial receiver to send what they're feeling or saying back to the initial receiver, and we can see whether or not we're making the connection there. Now, how do we do that? Well, in the past, one of the things that we've used for feedback loops has been survey research. And we do this continually. If you go to Walmart and you put your card into the thing, at the end of the transaction, it's going to ask you a one-question survey. Were you satisfied with Walmart? They tried to get you to, by giving you the opportunity to win a shopping spree, to answer longer surveys on your experiences with Walmart. And they've sort of given up on that. And now they just want you to, at the screen, text, touch whether or not, if you go through the self-checkout, you had a positive experience using a star system of rating. And how many of you actually do that? I don't. I grab the receipt and walk right out the door, right? So we've done that through survey research. This can be an enormously difficult way of getting feedback. And focusing on those kinds of instruments are enormously problematic. Those of us in marketing have written for a long time in academic marketing about the problems that are associated with trying to get people to tell you what they really think in this feedback loop. Why is that? Well, part of it could be that there isn't an understanding of the questions, or they're unclear, or they're ambiguous. Another part of it is, overwhelmingly, people have a tendency to be sort of polite, and they don't say, mean things. Or maybe they do, or they can be deviant responders where they're deliberately trying to skew the results of the survey, right? So these all can create problems in marketing that we have to overcome. So the promotional elements that we're going to use to reach the audience that we want are advertising, personal selling, public relations, sales promotion, and direct marketing. Now, some of these overlap with each other. Personal selling is also what? Overlap within the categories. It's direct marketing. Yeah, it is absolutely direct. Personal selling is a form of direct marketing. Not the only form, so they can overlap, but personal selling is a form of direct marketing. So you have to think about that. Why do we break it out as a separate category? Professional sales is one of the largest categories of the promotional element on its own. A huge, voluminous amount of business is done through professional selling, particularly at the B2B level. It's an enormously important aspect of selling. It's what we train. We have a sales program here at UCO, and we have the only program on campus that can say that we have over 90% placement of our majors and minors in field, and 80% of our majors make over 6 figures in their first year. We're the only one that can say that. Nursing can say that they have that high a success rate in placement. They can't say that they make 6 figures in their first year, usually. Now, if you're a nurse for long enough and you figure out the differentials, you're probably going to be making 6 figures, but not in your first year. So it's an enormously important part of the promotional mix. So what is advertising? Advertising is any paid, non-personal communication. So it has to be paid for in order to be classified as advertising. It has to be purchased by the person or the organization that is doing it. What does this allow for? It allows you to control the message. Now, again, you have to think about whether or not the message you're sending is actually the message that you want to convey. This is not trivial, but you have absolute control of the message. In other types of promotion, you may not have control over the message. You can put it out there, and what happens once it's out there is not necessarily within your control, or whether or not it will even be picked up. So you have control of the message. It uses mass media, TV, radio, magazines, and now the internet. And not just the internet, but what's probably one of the largest growing parts? It's not just the internet, but it is social media is one, but there's also how are you using social media? So historically, the way you used social media when the early parts of the movement were beginning, which the first social media platforms were emerging, I don't know, let's say roughly 30 years ago. How did you use that? Well, you interacted with it by getting on your desktop, because back then, even laptops were pretty expensive. Now they're still, depending on the laptop, pretty expensive. If you're using an Apple product, they're fairly expensive. Apple is pretty proud of their products, but you can absolutely get a, laptop that's not all that expensive. You can go to Walmart and buy a laptop, a decent laptop, for about $500. Decent laptop, right? Less than 500, you can get them for less than $500. The experience is probably not going to be as wonderful as you want it to be, but you're using it on your laptop, you're using it on your desktop, so that is internet. But what are we using now for most of our social media? What? Yeah. Phones, that's exactly it. We're now engaging in these platforms, we're interacting with these platforms on this. This is if you went back in time again to the dawn of social media, which would have been companies like MySpace, and I think MySpace is still around, maybe. Let's look and see. In that show, pull this up. Let's see if wow, I can't believe it. It is still around. That's crazy. People were engaging with this on their desktops, largely. Now, we're primarily engaging with this on these devices. Why? Because these devices are far more useful in engaging in social media. because it allows us to instantly tell the world what it is that we're doing, which is why we're on social media. And there are people that post entirely too much, in my opinion. They tell you every single thing that they're doing. And apparently we've become addicted to that, watching whether or not our friends are eating at, some restaurant or whatever. So this device has become enormously important, and how we engage in the advertising on mobile devices is becoming important. Historically speaking, advertising was expensive. It required, historically, that you create content, and that often involved the use of technical, specialized professionals in each specific medium. It took a lot to come up with, for example, an ad copy and layout for a newspaper or a magazine. It required oftentimes professional photography, and then that to be put into some kind of format that they could then use to make the actual tangible copies of newspapers. And that took a long time. The lead time took a long time, and it was expensive to do. So historically, advertising has been expensive, particularly if you think about television advertising, where you had to have a studio or at least a camera. Bob Mills, who sponsored the UCO sales program for a number of years, basically has like his own sort of production facility at his store where they make ads, and that's expensive to do. It's getting a lot cheaper. Why? Because the cameras on this device, I remember the first cameras that were on cell phones, they were horrible, and I thought, that'll never really catch on, because it was grainy. I don't know why you'd want to use the pictures from those early cameras. They weren't very good, but it did, and they got better, and they got better, and the camera on this device is now pretty good in terms of being able to take quality photos. And then you combine that with very cheap editing tools that you can use. You can get on, how many of you have used AI to generate a better picture of you for your social media? You can do it. Ask it to touch up, like come up with a better image so that you look absolutely pristine and like you're, the picture of health rather than, pale and pasty or blotchy or whatever. It's becoming a lot easier. But so historically speaking, it was very expensive to do this because it required all of these things that you had to have. It took a long time to produce things like this. It took a long time to produce newspaper, magazine ads. They had a lot of permanence once they were out there, which could be a big disadvantage. But it took a lot. Now we can come up with ads fairly quickly. If you get on Facebook, it's constantly trying to get you to try AI-generated videos. And you can make AI-generated videos, which has led to big questions with regard to ethics in this field. Because reality is not necessarily what's being generated out there, particularly in the political marketplace. We have a lot of things. And so, for example, my administrative assistant, so I have this other company that I inherited that I'm trying to sell, but I inherited this company when my mother passed away, and I have this administrator, and she's constantly coming up with stuff and telling me, and I'm like having to double check it. Some of it is accurate, but a big portion of it is it's made up content. It's not real. It's being generated by AI bots that are generating, and it's like some of it even appears when I'll start like trying to validate what it is that she's telling me, and it's like I'm having to search, really, really hard to find out whether or not that is absolutely accurate. I'm not finding it on NBC, ABC, CBS, and so I'm having to dig, and then I have to like figure out whether or not the source that's created this content in an attempt to influence you, right? What do we need for marketing? Well, we need at least two parties. We need to have something to exchange. That doesn't necessarily have to be money. What is it that they're trying to generate in terms of these controversies in the political marketplace? It's trying to get you to either react to a politician or a policy in a positive or negative way. And a lot of that content is being generated that's less than accurate, right? So it's getting a lot less expensive, but historically has been very expensive. Non-personal advertising is not personal. Now, again, as technology has moved, historically, advertising was designed for a large target audience. So we would, going back to what we talked about, in the first sort of set of materials, and in the first exam, or maybe the second exam, when we covered segmenting the market, what you would do is you would break the market down into what you thought were these particular segments, which are people who are similarly situated that have similar needs. And one of the things that I think I used as an example was, for example, this class represents at least one way of segmenting. Now, if I look out at you all are radically different in terms of, sort of the activities that you like, and we've got some variance, not as much as we used to. When I first started teaching at UCO, the average age of our freshmen was 29, so there was a lot of variance in my classrooms in terms of the age. There were a lot of people that were much older than 29 at that point in time. They had passed something called House Bill 1017, and it required that teachers go back and get certified to teach in the various fields. And so at the time I was a political scientist, and that meant that we had a whole lot of students that were returning that were high school teachers that were having to recertify or get up to date in teaching things. So you could no longer just put the coach into the American National Government or civics course in high school. They actually had to have more than just having had American National Government. At the collegiate level, they were going to have, I think, something like 12 hours at the time is what they wanted them to be certified. So there was a huge variance in terms of the age. But what is one thing that's in common that you all, that makes you a segment? Well, you all had a need for the materials that are used in this class, which meant you had to have the McGraw-Hill Connect stuff so that you could do at least the homework, read the material, and participate in the class activities, right? So that makes you a segment. So we would segment the population into groups, and then we would choose which segments we wanted to target, and then direct advertising towards those large targets. Now, what has happened historically, so this is what we did with advertising, is we chose these large targets, audience, and now, as a result of the fact that we are engaging more and more and we have artificial intelligence, we can pay for space and we can pay for advertising, and it's starting to slip between, and the lines between advertising and direct marketing are beginning to blur as we can engage in micro-targeting using psychographics, which we talked about, or geofencing, that we give up all of this information constantly by using this device, and we know where you are. Why is it that as you're driving, marketing persuasion for various things starts to pop up? Well, because based on geofencing information, the lines are becoming blurred. Again, historically, advertising didn't allow for immediate feedback. You had to put an ad out there, and then you had to wait to see. And it was oftentimes difficult. So we would develop an ad, say for the Super Bowl. This is the one time, so I talked about zipping and zapping in order to avoid advertising. The Super Bowl is the one time of year that we all want to watch the ads. People who don't even like football watch the Super Bowl, and they have watched it anymore, for two reasons. People stopped watching after the wardrobe malfunction occurred, because for the most part, until this last year, the halftime shows, it was, when I was a kid, the halftime show was a big deal. People would watch for the halftime show. And then after the wardrobe malfunction, which was Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake, they didn't have anybody who was of any relevance or anybody who was under about 60 years of age performing at the halftime show. And so people stopped watching the Super Bowl for the halftime show, but they still continued to watch for the ads. And now, because the ads come out in advance, we don't necessarily do that. So it took a long time. We would develop this ad for the Super Bowl, and it would take a long time to determine whether or not, after that ad had shown at the Super Bowl, which was the most expensive ad space in television history every year in the United States, whether or not that had a huge impact on sales, right? And that's one way that we would measure it, was they would actually go out and Nielsen would ask people if they saw ads and things like that, but also whether or not we saw an increase in sales. So it took a long time to get feedback. Again, as a result of the fact that we are now able to get feedback enormously quickly, because this device tells us, we know if you see an ad, whether or not you clicked on it, and whether or not you then converted, what the conversion is from just a click through to actually purchasing services. But historically speaking, it took a long time to get the feedback in advertising. Particularly on TV, radio, and magazines. The internet, again, once it became not just static stuff, so again, in the early ages of the internet, what companies did was they put up largely static websites that didn't allow for a great deal of interaction with the website. And now you have an enormous amount of interaction with the website, and that we can count, and we can track. And one way we do that is by, you agreeing to have cookies and things like that on the website so that they can track when you're on the company's site and whether or not you're interacting with them through various platforms, right? So, but again, historically speaking, these things were very difficult to do. As a result of this, as a result of the computer, and then the shrinking down of that, right, which has become enormously important, if you went back to World War II, you now hold more computing power in your hand with your cell phone than existed in the entire world during World War II. That's pretty incredible to think about. And as we have gotten more and more sophisticated with this and our ability to track and things like that, it has radically changed and blurred again the lines. So TV and radio, magazines, newspapers are becoming less and less relevant, particularly to your generation, but they're still important. Why? Well, although your generation doesn't interact with a lot of these, I can't think of the last time I've actually looked at a magazine or a newspaper. If I do, I interact with the newspapers generally on my phone by I subscribe to a number of newspapers. Since I'm a local politician, I subscribe to the local newspaper in Guthrie, and I also subscribe to the Daily Oklahoman because I kind of need to know what's going on in Oklahoma in terms of the news, and then also national newspapers. So I'm interacting with them with this. But if you actually get hard copies, and there are people who still get hard copies, people like my aunt, who's 89 years old, and why does she get a hard copy? Well, that's how she grew up. Getting her information was by reading magazines and newspapers and things like that. And they still want that tactile experience. And so they're still important. Although the vast majority of people no longer use that, they're still important because, so radio or magazines, newspapers, things like that, radio are still important because that generation still remembers that, and they still have some nostalgia, and they still have, that's the way they want to consume their information. And that generation has more what than your generation? More money. They have more money. The biggest transfer of wealth in this country has been from young to old as a result of retirement savings and things like that. Historically speaking, wealth was held by those people who were actually working. Because the minute you retired, before things like Social Security, you didn't have any, right? So these are still important. Television among that generation is still important because that's what they grew up with. I don't think my nephew has watched a television. I take it back, he did. We actually got him to watch a movie with us when we were on spring break. Couldn't get the other kids to watch a movie with the adults, but we actually did get him to watch a movie on a television. But the vast majority of you, do any of you actually watch television? You actually watch TV? Really? I mean, most people, my nephew will come through the living room and he's just, earbuds in, staring at this device like this. So these mass media are still important. However, they're diminishing in terms of their importance, particularly with your generation. Personal selling is a direct two-way flow of communication. Now, one of the things that makes this important, and one of the reasons why you find personal selling or professional sales used in particularly the business-to-business context, is because you really need to have that dynamic communication, particularly when you're talking about goods or services which may be highly customizable and very situation specific to the client that you're serving. So two-way direct flow of communication between the buyer and seller. It allows where the presentation is made. It reduces wasted coverage. So if you take out an ad, again, historically, in a newspaper, a magazine, a radio spot, a TV ad on the Super Bowl, you're going to get a whole lot of wasted coverage. One of the most popular Super Bowl ads that I remember as a kid that was an award-winning ad was the Herding Cats commercial. Have any of you seen, have I played this commercial for you in here? I haven't played it for you. This was the year that it came out. It was a Herding Cats. It was a Super Bowl, as I recall. So how many of you remember, now that you've watched the ad, what company produced the ad? You remember what company was it? EDS, okay. Do you know what EDS is?
I assume it's a marketing platform or.
They're no longer in business. I don't believe. I think. Let me make sure. Let me Google that. This has become a thing. Let me make sure that I'm correct. They were started by, let's see, EDS. They were started by H. Ross Perot, who was one of the first billionaires. He, let's see, Electronic Data Systems, 2008 to 2009. They were traded on the New York Stock Exchange. It became defunct in 2017, so they're no longer in business. I was correct. Yeah. He would buy, yeah, and one of the reasons that was one of the reasons that he actually became somewhat competitive in the election. And if you want to talk about, so he ran as a third-party candidate in 1992. I actually met him one time in Dallas in North Park Mall, which is a kind of an exclusive area in Dallas. And he would buy huge blocks of time. He was the first person who could self-fund their campaign. He was the first politician to be able to do that. And he bought this amount of time on television, and it was always like a lecture, which is probably one of the reasons that he was not terribly successful. I mean, first of all, he's running as an independent, which means that you're going to have a hard time for a variety of structural reasons. We have a hard time getting third parties on the ballot. And even if they get on the ballot, they have a hard time. Now, there are some exceptions to that. There have been a number of independents that have won elections, but it's difficult because we have a built-in bias in this country because we have single member districts and it's a first past the post election in which the winner takes all. So in other countries where they have more parties, one of the reasons that they have more parties is that usually they have combinations of both single member districts and then proportional representation in part of their legislature based on the number of votes that a party actually receives. We don't do that. So it's a winner take all. It's first past the post, which means that you don't, in the general election, have to get a majority vote in order to be elected. So if you have 3 people running, one of the third parties that popped up in Oklahoma that actually managed to get people on the ballot was called the Libertarian Party. And they would have candidates, and they still do from time to time, have a candidate from the Libertarian Party. Most people just file as an independent. And what they'll do is they'll pull off enough votes from the 2 major party candidates that nobody will get, in some instances, a majority of the vote, but they get a plurality of the vote. And because it's first past the post, it means that those third party candidates are oftentimes not very successful. So Ross Perot runs as this third party candidate. You're correct. He took out huge amounts of ad time. And it was a lecture. He had these charts and graphs, and he said sort of funny things, but he got lost. He would lose people because they were so long, right? We're trained to hear ads in about 30 seconds or a minute at the most. And that's what we want. And he was taking out these, like basically infomercial type things. And he would come up with these charts and graphs. And again, he would say sort of entertaining things like he said, now he ran against Bill Clinton and the first George Bush, Poppy Bush, the first President Bush, which was George Herbert Walker Bush. The second one was just George Walker Bush. So the first President Bush had gone into Iraq and invaded Iraq because Iraq had invaded Kuwait and we didn't want them to have control of the field. That's not what he said, of the oil fields there, but that's what it amounted to. And Ross Perot would say funny things like, now, if I ever decide to go to war so that we can put some gold plate back on an emir's bathroom, just drag me out the White House and shoot me. And that was pretty funny. And then he said, if you got a better idea than all of these charts and graphs, you just tell me, I'm all ears. And that was kind of funny because he had these huge ears. And so but he would lose people in these huge infomercial type advertising. But it was the first time that a third party candidate was actually maybe going to even have a shot at getting some electoral votes, which was a big deal. What it did do in the election, according to a lot of political scientists at the time, was it sealed George Herbert Walker Bush's fate. It made the unelectable Bill Clinton electable because Ross Perot pulled enough votes, according to political scientists at the time, from George Herbert Walker Bush that he threw the election basically into the Democrats' hands. They should not have been able to win that election, but they did. And all of this is going back to advertising, and the difference between advertising and personal selling is that it's a lot of wasted coverage. What Ross Perot did when he had these huge infomercial type ads was it created a lot of wasted coverage because you're appealing to a huge percentage or sector of the population that is not going to vote. In general elections, in presidential general elections, which is what he was running in, what percentage of the American population that's eligible to vote actually goes out and votes? Well, it's about 50% in a presidential election. When you take out these ads, you're using a huge amount of coverage that you're wasting on people that don't care, that are not ever going to go out and vote. Likewise, EDS with that ad, so Ross Perot has this company, EDS, and he does this ad at the Super Bowl, the Herding Cats commercial. Nobody knew, who the ad was for. It was funny. It was extremely funny, but nobody could remember the company 30 seconds after the ad aired. And EDS was largely a business-to-business provider of technology services. Well, who's watching the Super Bowl? It's not business to business. It's a lot of individual consumers out there. Now, yeah, some of them are business people and they're making business decisions, but you have this huge amount of wasted coverage. Personal selling cuts that out. It reduces that wasted coverage because if you engage in a sophisticated enough vetting process of your clientele, you shouldn't have that wasted coverage. You should know that these are people, particularly in a B2B context, that these are people that need your services. If you've engaged in enough of the groundwork and the prospecting, you eliminate that wasted coverage. It's impossible to eliminate that wasted coverage, or in the past, with regard to advertising, because you have this huge volume of people out there that are not ever going to use or need your product or service. BC Clark used to have a billboard on the Kilpatrick Turnpike that advertised Rolex. Now, the shop that's closest to that turnpike has lost their Rolex dealership. So they advertise something other than Rolex. I think they're now advertising Breitling on that billboard the last time I went by it. But for years and years and years, they advertised Rolex on that billboard. The Rolex that I wear, the two-tone, starts at about $15,000 new. How many people driving down the turnpike see that ad, saw that ad, and are going to buy a Rolex? Not a lot, right? Most people don't want to spend that amount of money on a watch. And so you have this huge wasted coverage that you eliminate in personal selling. It also gives you the ability to, for example, what I can do in this classroom, which is I can see whether or not you're tuning in to me, whether or not I need to change my inflection, or I need to throw a duck at you to wake you up, so that I can tell whether or not you're actually engaging with the material, right? Because I can see you. It's a two-way flow in this classroom, and personal selling does the same thing. It allows for that instant feedback. I am out of time, so we will stop there. There will be on Thursday, critical thinking challenge that you have that will be put up, and hopefully I'll remember to open it this time before Thursday. What I'm going to ask you to do for this one is I want you to segment, given the idea that Love's is going to start using electronic vehicle charging stations, segment that market for potential advertising, and then using AI, determine how it segmented that and whether or not you think those segments are actually good segments for the EV vehicles, right? So just spitballing it here is throwing out ideas. Who buys EV vehicles now? Well, they're still fairly expensive, right? So it's going to give you an idea of like whether or not AI is coming up with good segments for your markets. So I will put that up. It will be posted. If you got ducks, come and see me. Let me stop the feed. Oops, previous in show. Let me end.